The prairie stretched endlessly under a dimming sky, the last rays of the sun fading into streaks of red and gold. A cold wind whipped across the open land, carrying with it the scent of dust, damp earth, and the faint, distant tang of smoke. A young woman ran desperately, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her shoes scuffing the dry soil as her eyes darted constantly over her shoulder. Each step threatened to betray her exhaustion, and yet she could not stop. Behind her, she could feel the danger drawing closer, men whose faces she had barely glimpsed, but whose intentions were all too clear. Ahead, a solitary cabin appeared like a promise in the twilight. Its wooden walls were weathered, the roof slightly sagging, but smoke rose from the chimney, promising warmth, shelter, and possibly safety. She pushed forward, hope and fear warring inside her. Yet as she drew nearer, she froze. A figure emerged from the barn beside the cabin, tall, broad-shouldered, with dark, sun-kissed skin and long hair tied neatly. The unmistakable features of an Apache man marked him, and instinctively, fear gripped her anew. Whispers she had heard of wild men, of dangerous warriors living apart from civilization, filled her mind. Her heart raced, caught between the terror of the pursuers behind her and the uncertainty of the stranger ahead. The man's eyes caught hers instantly. There was no hesitation, no blink of surprise, only a steady, piercing gaze that seemed to measure her, sizing up her fear and her vulnerability. The wind carried silence between them, broken only by the distant creak of the barn door. Then his voice cut sharply through the evening air. "Get inside, before it's too late." The words were in order, urgent and commanding. She froze, trembling, unsure whether he was friend or foe. Her instinct screamed to keep running, yet another part of her, a quieter, more desperate instinct, recognized that his warning carried truth and authority. The danger she fled was real, relentless, and if she did not heed his words, she might not survive the night. Her gaze flicked back toward the prairie. The men who pursued her were shadows in the dimming light, relentless, cruel, and fast approaching. The pounding of her own heart was mirrored by the distant thud of hooves, and the occasional metallic glint of weapons catching the sun's last light. She swallowed hard, terror twisting her stomach, but the rancher's steady gaze and the absolute certainty in his command pulled her forward. Slowly trembling, she obeyed. Each step toward the cabin was hesitant, yet purposeful. As she crossed the threshold, she felt his presence solid and unyielding behind her, a shield against the threat she could not yet confront. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke, leather, and the faint musk of a life lived close to the land. A lamp flickered weakly on the table, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The rancher closed the door with deliberate care and slid the bar into place. His hand briefly brushed hers, a grounding gesture that conveyed both caution and protection. Then he moved to the window, scanning the horizon, his posture tense but composed. His voice came again, this time low, carrying a quiet but firm command. "Stay low. Do not move unless I tell you." The woman pressed herself against the floorboards. Trembling, yet a small sense of relief settled over her. For the first time in hours, she was not completely alone. Whatever terror waited outside, she realized, was not the only force in her world tonight. A protector stood before her, a man whose strength, vigilance, and unwavering presence offered a fragile but tangible hope that she might survive the night. The woman pressed herself against the cabin floor, her hands trembling as she tried to steady her ragged breathing. The fire in the small hearth flickered weakly, sending shadows dancing across the wooden walls, yet it offered more comfort than she could have imagined. Outside, the wind howled through the prairie, carrying with it the faint sounds of hooves and distant shouting. Her chest tightened at every creak and whistle of the cold evening air, but the presence of the Apache rancher nearby gave her the smallest, yet profound, sense of safety. He moved quietly around the cabin, checking the locks, securing the shutters, and adjusting the rifle at his side. Each movement was deliberate and controlled, revealing a skill born of years spent surviving in the wilderness. Even in the dim light, she could see the sharp angles of his face, the dark intensity of his eyes, and the tension in his muscles. It was clear he was a man used to danger, a man who had survived far worse than a desperate group of men chasing a frightened young woman. "They're close," he muttered, almost to himself. He peered through a narrow crack in the window, his hand resting lightly on the rifle's stock. His eyes narrowed, analyzing the horizon, tracking movements she could barely discern. The woman's pulse spiked, and she instinctively clutched the blanket tighter around her shoulders. The reality of their situation pressed down on her. They were not safe yet, not by any means. "Stay low. Don't make a sound," he instructed, his voice calm but edged with authority. She obeyed immediately, lowering herself further against the floor. Her mind raced. What if he was wrong? What if the men outside had already spotted her? The terror from earlier returned with a new intensity, but she fought to keep still, trusting instinctively that the rancher's words carried more weight than her fear. Minutes stretched. The winds howl, the faint crunch of hooves over dry grass, and distant shouts seemed amplified in the small cabin. She could feel her heartbeat in her throat, each beat a painful reminder of the vulnerability she felt. Yet, amid the fear, she noticed the care with which he moved, how he positioned himself strategically between her and the windows, how every gesture seemed designed to protect her. There was a strange comfort in this precision, a reassurance that someone was watching over her, calculating every possible threat. A sudden, sharp knock on the door made her flinch violently. The rancher's hand tightened on the rifle, and he moved forward with controlled speed. "Quiet," he whispered. The knock came again, louder, more insistent, as if testing the cabin's defenses. She could hear the muffled voices outside, men calling her name, their tones cruel and threatening. Panic rose in her chest, but she held her ground, following the silent guidance of the man who had saved her. He stepped to the door and opened it just enough to aim the barrel of his rifle at the attackers. The men outside faltered, realizing suddenly that they were no longer hunting a lone, defenseless girl. Instead, they faced a man whose calm, measured presence radiated power. He did not shout, he did not beg, they hesitated, caught between their arrogance and the stark reality of his skill. The woman pressed herself further against the floor, shaking violently, but an unfamiliar sense of trust began to grow within her. This man, dangerous and commanding in his own right, was her shield. She understood that survival tonight depended not just on hiding, but on following his lead, moving only when he directed, and believing that he would protect her no matter what doubt the men outside eventually receded, though she knew they had not vanished completely. The cabin settled into a tense quiet, the fire crackling softly, and the rancher finally lowered his rifle, his dark eyes scanning her for any sign of injury or distress. "You're safe for now," he said quietly, his voice steady. She exhaled shakily, the tremors in her body slowly easing. It was the first moment she had felt even a fraction of relief since her flight across the prairie, and she realized something remarkable. She was no longer completely alone. Someone was watching over her, standing between her and the world's cruelty, and for the first time, she felt that fragile thread of trust begin to form. The cabin remained tense and silent, save for the soft crackle of the fire and the occasional whistle of wind through the cracks in the wooden walls. The woman stayed pressed against the floor, wrapped tightly in the blanket, her hands trembling as adrenaline still pulsed through her veins. Her eyes darted nervously toward the windows, knowing the threat outside had not disappeared. She could hear muffled voices again, men approaching, cautious but relentless. The prairie offered no refuge, no hiding place. Tonight, survival meant trusting the stranger who had already risked everything to save her. The Apache rancher moved methodically, checking the doors and windows with a practiced eye. Every step he took was deliberate, controlled, and precise, revealing the instincts of a man who had faced danger countless times. She watched him with a mixture of awe and fear. The authority in his movements, the quiet confidence, the steady assurance that he was fully aware of every possible threat, it all made her feel small, vulnerable, yet strangely safe in his presence. "They're testing us," he muttered under his breath, his eyes scanning the horizon through a narrow slit in the window. "They want to see if we're weak. They want to find any opening." She nodded silently, barely daring to breathe. Her instinct screamed at her to flee, yet there was no fleeing tonight. She had been given no choice but to trust him, and something deep within her told her that this man's skill, his awareness, and his determination were their only chance to survive. Then came the first shove at the cabin door, sharp and deliberate. She gasped, her body instinctively recoiling, but he was already there, steady as stone. He placed himself between her and the door, rifle raised, his eyes narrowing at the attackers outside. His presence alone was intimidating a force that made the men hesitate. They had expected an easy target, a frightened girl, but now they faced a wall of resolve, and the shift in power was immediate. "Stay behind me," he ordered, his voice calm but commanding. She obeyed without hesitation, pressing herself close to him. Her fear was still intense, but mingled with a strange sense of awe. She realized that he wasn't just defending himself, he was defending her. Every movement, every calculated action was meant to shield her from harm. Shots rang out suddenly, muffled but sharp. The splintering of wood made her jump, and she pressed her face into the floor, trying to make herself invisible. The rancher's hands were steady, his aim precise. Each shot forced the men outside to retreat slightly, each action a lesson in composure under extreme pressure. Despite the chaos, he never lost control. Even in the middle of danger, he remained focused, confident, and unyielding. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The women's fear began to shift subtly, transforming into something more fragile but real. She realized that survival tonight depended not only on hiding but also on following his lead completely. His protection was absolute, and in that knowledge, she found a small measure of comfort. The attackers eventually withdrew, their confidence broken. The cabin fell into tense silence once more, broken only by the crackle of the dying fire. She sank onto the floor, trembling, yet relief began to seep in. The rancher lowered his rifle and glanced at her. "You're safe for now," he said quietly. His tone carried no triumph, only fact, but the words resonated with a sense of security she hadn't felt in hours. She exhaled shakily, feeling the first hint of hope. For the first time that night, she realized she was not entirely alone. A man she barely knew had risked himself to save her life, and in his calm, protective presence, she found a fragile sense of trust beginning to take root, trust that might one day grow into something more than survival. The cabin had finally settled into an uneasy quiet. The distant sounds of the attackers' retreat faded into the horizon, leaving only the low whistle of the wind through the prairie and the soft crackle of the fire in the hearth. The woman remained huddled on the floor, the blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Her body still shook with the residual adrenaline, though a faint sense of relief began to creep through her fear. She dared not move too much, not yet fully trusting the calm, but her racing thoughts slowly allowed her to focus on the man who had saved her. The Apache rancher moved with calm precision, checking the barricades he had placed and glancing occasionally through the windows. His movements were fluid and confident, the actions of someone who had faced danger countless times. Even in the aftermath of chaos, there was no rush in him, no signs of panic. She noticed the small gestures, the way he adjusted the fire, checked his rifle, and ensured the cabin's doors were secure. Every motion spoke of vigilance and competence, and she realized of a protective instinct that had guided his every decision that night. "You need to warm yourself," he said suddenly, his voice low, calm, and measured. She flinched slightly at the sound, not expecting him to address her directly. "Sit closer to the fire. You cannot face another night in that state." She hesitated, still caught between fear and exhaustion, but the commanding tone in his voice left her no choice. Slowly, she moved closer to the hearth, perching on the edge of the worn rug, careful to keep her movements quiet. His eyes followed her, assessing, protective, and she felt a strange mix of awe and gratitude. She was still terrified, still vulnerable, but in his presence, she felt the first thread of safety wrap around her, fragile but unmistakable. He handed her a small bundle of dry wood, encouraging her to stoke the fire. She obeyed, noticing how his guidance was firm yet patient, his tone softening when he realized her hands trembled from fear and cold. As she worked, she glimpsed a side of him that contrasted sharply with the fearsome image she had first conjured, the quiet care for another human being. Even one he barely knew was tangible. "They won't give up easily," he said, his gaze returning to the horizon outside the window. "But you survived the first test. That matters." His voice held no arrogance, no attempt to impress. It was simple, factual, and yet comforting in its honesty. The woman's throat tightened. I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. Her voice was raw, the words almost lost in the crackle of the fire. She realized that gratitude alone was insufficient to capture the depth of what she felt. Fear mingled with relief, terror mingled with awe, and trust mingled with something she could not yet name. "You do not need to thank me," he replied softly. "Tonight, survival is enough." His eyes softened briefly as they met hers, and she caught a rare glimpse of gentleness beneath his strong, commanding exterior. For a moment, the intensity of the earlier confrontation faded, replaced by quiet understanding and mutual recognition of the night's gravity. Minutes passed in silence, but it was a comfortable silence, punctuated only by the fire and the occasional movement of the rancher preparing their small cabin for the night. She noticed the small details, the careful placement of the rifle within reach, the way he kept himself between her and potential threats, the steady, unwavering presence that made her realize something vital. She was no longer entirely alone. For the first time since her flight began, she allowed herself to breathe fully, to feel a fragile sense of safety. Here, within the protective walls of the cabin and under the watchful eyes of the Apache rancher, she began to understand that survival was not just about escaping danger, it was about trusting someone to stand by you in the face of it. And for the first time, she sensed that trust growing, fragile but undeniable, between them. The cabin had settled into a fragile calm, though the woman remained on edge, her muscles still tight with lingering fear. She sat closer to the hearth now, the blanket around her shoulders providing warmth but also a small comfort to her frayed nerves. Outside, the prairie stretched endlessly under the fading moonlight, and she knew danger could return at any moment. Yet, for the first time that night, she felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. Trust. The Apache rancher moved deliberately around the cabin, checking the locks and adjusting the rifle near the door. Every motion was purposeful, revealing a man who had survived countless threats and knew the weight of responsibility. She watched him, fascinated despite herself. There was a quiet authority in his presence, a calm that seemed to absorb the tension in the room and redistribute it as reassurance. Finally, she summoned the courage to speak, her voice hesitant and trembling. "Why? Why did you save me?" The words came out almost in a whisper, her chest tightening as she dared to ask. He paused in his movements, meeting her gaze steadily. There was no judgment, no surprise, only a careful, measured response. "Because you had nowhere else to go," he said simply. His tone was matter-of-fact, yet carried a quiet weight. "And because I do not leave the defenseless to be hunted. That is not the way I live." She swallowed hard, struck by the plain honesty in his words. It was unlike anything she had heard before. There were no lectures, no grand speeches, just a simple principle, lived and practiced. For the first time that night, she felt a sense of gratitude so profound it made her chest ache. I ran from them," she admitted, her voice faltering. They would have killed me if I hadn't run. I didn't even understand why." Her hands trembled as she wrapped the blanket tighter around herself. Fear, exhaustion, and relief collided inside her, leaving her raw and vulnerable. He listened silently, allowing her words to fill the space between them. When she finished, he spoke again, calm and unwavering. "The world is full of men who hunt because they can. You survived because you were clever and because you did not stop running. And now you are here. That is what matters." For the first time, a sense of peace began to settle over her. The adrenaline that had carried her across the prairie ebbed, replaced by a cautious hope. She realized that, for the first time, someone was on her side not for gain, not for amusement, but simply because it was right. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice low and uncertain. "I don't even know your name." He inclined his head slightly, an almost imperceptible gesture of acknowledgement. "Names matter less than actions," he said simply. "But if it helps, you may call me what you like." "I am here to ensure you survive, nothing more." She studied him, noting the strength in his posture, the quiet intensity of his gaze, and the rare gentleness in his actions. Slowly, she allowed herself to relax a little, feeling the tension in her shoulders ease. She understood that her survival now depended not only on him, but also on the trust she had placed in him. Minutes passed in silence, but it was a silence that no longer felt oppressive. The wind continued to howl outside, and the distant sounds of the prairie reminded them both that danger still lingered. Yet inside the cabin, a fragile sanctuary had formed. Two strangers, bound together by circumstance, fear, and the shared experience of survival, had begun to form a connection deeper than mere necessity. In the quiet, the woman allowed herself to hope, fragile, uncertain, but real. She realized that survival was not just about escaping harm. It was about finding someone who would stand with you, who would protect you without expectation. And in that moment, she felt a tentative bond forming, one that might grow into something far stronger as the night stretched on. The fragile calm of the cabin offered little real comfort. Though the fire flickered warmly in the hearth, the woman's nerves remained taut, her body still tense from the adrenaline of the night. The wind outside whispered through the cracks in the walls, carrying faint sounds of movement across the prairie. Every creak, every rustle, made her heart leap. Danger, she knew, had not vanished, it was merely biding its time. The Apache rancher moved quietly around the cabin, checking the doors and windows again, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond. Each gesture was deliberate, measured, a silent promise that he had already considered every possible threat. The woman watched him, both in awe and with a lingering fear. There was something magnetic in his calm, something that demanded trust even when her instincts screamed for flight. "They're back," he muttered under his breath, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He adjusted the rifle in his hands, the leather strap brushing softly against his wrist. She pressed herself closer to the floor, clutching the blanket tightly around her shoulders, her pulse racing. Her mind churned with panic. How had they found her again? Could they truly be so relentless? They shouldn't have, she stammered, her voice trembling. "I ran so far. I thought I had lost them." "They did not lose sight," he said quietly, eyes scanning the prairie with unwavering focus. "Some men do not give up easily. Some men are cruel enough to chase the weak until there is nothing left." His tone was steady, factual, carrying no fear, only determination. A sudden shout rang from outside, sharp and threatening, followed by the sound of splintering wood. The men were testing the cabin's defenses again. Her stomach churned as panic surged, but the rancher's calm presence grounded her. "Stay low," he instructed firmly. "Do exactly as I say." She obeyed instinctively, sinking further against the floorboards. Her heart pounded in her chest, and yet she could feel the first glimmer of a strange, fragile trust. He would not let them take her. He had already proven that the men outside pressed their attack, testing every possible entry point. The rancher moved like a shadow, each shot calculated, each movement precise. The sound of gunfire rang sharp through the morning air, splintering wood and kicking up dust. He never panicked. Each action was designed to protect her, to ensure that she remained unharmed. The woman could only watch, trembling, as he moved with a confidence that bordered on the supernatural, an unflinching shield between her and death. Minutes stretched, filled with tension and fear, until finally, the attackers began to retreat. Their courage had faltered, their advantage lost against a man whose skill, awareness, and resolve left no opening. The cabin, once again, fell into tense silence. The woman sank to the floor, her body trembling but alive, and allowed herself a deep, shuddering breath. She met the rancher's gaze, seeing the unwavering calm in his dark eyes. "It's done," he said softly. "You're safe for now." Relief washed over her, mingling with awe and gratitude. She realized that survival tonight had not been hers alone. It was a joint effort, a delicate balance between fear and trust, danger and protection. For the first time, she understood the weight of relying on someone else and the strange comfort it could bring. Outside, the prairie remained silent, the threat having withdrawn for the moment. Inside the cabin, the woman allowed herself to feel something she had long thought impossible, a sense of safety, even if temporary, and the beginnings of trust in the man who had risked everything for her. She realized that survival was no longer just a matter of running. It was about standing with someone who would fight alongside her, and perhaps one day more than just survive. The cabin had settled into a tense quiet after the retreat of the attackers. The first faint light of dawn filtered through the small windows, casting pale streaks across the floorboards. The woman still sat near the hearth, wrapped tightly in her blanket, her body slowly unwinding from the night's terror. Every muscle ached, yet a curious sense of calm had begun to replace the adrenaline that had driven her through fear. The Apache rancher remained vigilant, checking the barricades and rifle, but even he allowed a moment's pause, his eyes softening as they met hers. She watched him, feeling a strange mixture of awe, gratitude, and cautious hope. For the first time that night, she realized she was not alone, that someone had chosen to stand with her, to shield her from danger not for gain, but because it was the right thing to do. A part of her long-buried trust began to stir. I don't know what I would have done without you," she admitted quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. The words felt clumsy, inadequate, yet they carried the depth of her gratitude. She had survived the prairie, the chase, and the threat of capture, but the realization of how much her survival had depended on him filled her with a mixture of relief and awe. He moved closer, crouching near the hearth, keeping a respectful distance. "You survived," he said simply, his tone steady, almost as if stating a fact. "Fear does not make you weak. Survival is not about bravery. It is about what you do despite the fear. You made it here." "That shows strength," her chest tightened. The praise, though measured, touched something deep inside her. She had spent so long fleeing from danger, from cruelty, from people who could not be trusted, that she had forgotten what it meant to rely on another human being. Yet here, in this small cabin, she felt that trust beginning to form, tentative, fragile, but undeniable. "I've never trusted anyone before," she admitted, voice trembling. "I don't know how to. I don't know if I should." She looked down at her hands, unable to meet his gaze. The weight of her past of betrayal, neglect, and fear pressed down on her, making vulnerability a terrifying prospect. He regarded her quietly, his dark eyes steady and unjudging. "Trust is not given blindly," he said softly. "It is earned, but sometimes it begins in moments like these. You trusted me enough to enter the cabin when you had every reason to doubt. That was the first step. Speaking now, that is the next." She lifted her eyes to meet his, startled by the clarity and calm in his voice. It was as if the mere act of standing in his presence offered a promise of protection, of guidance, of shared strength. For the first time that night, she felt a small flicker of hope, not just for survival, but for something more intangible, something that could grow into a bond stronger than fear. Minutes passed, the silence filled only by the crackle of the fire. The wind outside howled softly through the prairie, but inside, the cabin had become a fragile sanctuary. She felt herself leaning, metaphorically, on him not out of weakness, but because she knew that her life had been intertwined with his in ways she could not yet fully understand. "You must eat something," he said after a while, his tone calm but firm. "Rest will help. The night is not yet over, and we cannot face what comes next unprepared." She nodded, swallowing her fear, and realized that she would follow his lead. Her survival now depended not only on her own instincts but on the quiet strength of the man beside her. And in that quiet understanding, a fragile connection took root, one born of trust, survival, and the unspoken knowledge that they would face whatever came next together. The cabin had fallen into a tense yet quiet rhythm. The fire in the hearth cast flickering shadows across the walls, giving life to the small space where the woman had taken tentative refuge. The wind continued to howl outside, rattling the wooden walls and shaking the cabin ever so slightly, but inside she found a fragile sense of safety. The presence of the Apache rancher, vigilant and unwavering, gave her the first real comfort she had felt in hours or perhaps years. She shifted closer to the fire, her hands wrapped around her knees as the warmth slowly seeped into her chilled body. For the first time since fleeing across the prairie, she allowed herself to breathe fully, her chest rising and falling in a rhythm that was no longer dictated entirely by fear. Yet beneath the relief, a deep unease remained, a fear she could not shake. Not just of the men outside, but of her own past. Finally, she found the courage to speak, her voice low and hesitant. I should tell you," she murmured, glancing nervously at the rancher. His eyes, dark and calm, met hers without judgment, silently encouraging her to continue. "I didn't just run from strangers," she confessed, her voice breaking slightly. "I ran from my own family. My father, he wanted to sell me to anyone who would take me. I ran because I had no choice." Her words trembled on the edge of revelation, raw and unpolished, but she spoke them nonetheless. The rancher's expression remained controlled, but his eyes softened, absorbing the weight of her confession. He did not speak immediately, allowing her the space to release the fear she had carried silently for so long. In that quiet, he became more than a protector. He became a witness to her truth, a steady presence in the turbulence of her memories. When she had finished, he finally spoke, his voice calm and deliberate. "I see," he said simply. "You ran to survive. That is not weakness, it is strength. It shows wisdom and courage. You are alive because you refused to surrender." She swallowed hard, feeling a mixture of relief and vulnerability. For the first time, someone had not judged her, not scolded, not dismissed her story as weakness or folly. Here, in the dim firelight, she felt the faint beginnings of trust taking root, delicate and trembling, but undeniable. I've never trusted anyone before," she admitted quietly, her hands trembling as they clutched the blanket. "I don't even know why I'm telling you this. I feel like I can." The rancher inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the weight of her words. "Trust is earned," he said softly, "but sometimes it begins in moments like these. You trusted me enough to enter the cabin when danger threatened. Speaking now, that is the next step. You are learning to rely on someone other than yourself." A quiet understanding passed between them, unspoken yet profound. She realized that this man, who had risked his life to protect her, was offering more than safety. He was offering her the possibility of hope, connection, and the fragile promise of a life not defined solely by fear. Minutes passed in comfortable silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the occasional gust of wind outside. She felt herself relax ever so slightly, the tension in her body easing as the fear and isolation of the night began to lift. In this small, weathered cabin, the bond between them deepened, not born of words alone, but of shared experience, protection, and the courage to reveal oneself in the face of danger. Finally, she whispered, almost to herself, "Thank you for saving me, for trusting me enough to let me survive." The rancher's gaze softened, and for a fleeting moment, the weight of his authority seemed to melt into quiet reassurance. "You survived," he said simply. "And now we face what comes next together." For the first time, she allowed herself to hope, not just for safety, but for the possibility that trust and courage could endure beyond the night. And as the firelight danced across the cabin walls, she understood that her survival was now intertwined with his, in ways that could not easily be undone. Dawn had barely begun to touch the horizon when the first signs of movement stirred on the prairie. The woman, still huddled near the hearth, sensed it immediately, the subtle shift in the wind, the faint crunch of footsteps over dry grass. Her chest tightened, and a cold dread settled over her, but the presence of the Apache rancher gave her a flicker of reassurance. "They're coming back," he murmured, scanning the horizon with a careful, unwavering gaze. His rifle was ready, his stance alert but composed, a living barrier between her and the danger beyond. She pressed herself closer to the floor, her body trembling not from the cold now, but from fear and anticipation. Her mind raced, wondering if she had the courage to survive what was coming. "They shouldn't have found us again," she whispered, voice shaking. I thought we were safe." "Safety is a fleeting thing," he said quietly. "But we will face them, and we will survive. That is what matters." Outside, the attackers tested the cabin, pushing against the door and peering through the windows. The sound of splintering wood and distant shouts sent shivers through her spine. Yet she watched him with a mixture of awe and trust. He moved like a shadow, precise and controlled, every gesture deliberate. His presence transformed the cabin from a fragile refuge into a fortress. "Stay low," he instructed firmly. "Follow my lead. Move only when I tell you." She obeyed instinctively, pressing herself closer to the floor. Her fear was fierce, but tempered by the trust she had developed. She realized that survival was no longer just her own responsibility, it was a shared endeavor. Her life depended on him, just as his actions now depended on careful strategy and precision. Gunfire erupted, sharp and decisive. Splinters flew from the door as he fired, each shot calculated to defend and protect, not to provoke. The attackers hesitated, realizing that the girl they had pursued was no longer vulnerable, and that her protector was a man whose skill and determination were unmatched. She clutched the blanket around her tightly, heart racing, yet felt an odd surge of courage simply by witnessing his control and strength. Minutes passed like hours, the tension stretching every moment taut with fear. The attackers tested every approach, yet each attempt was met with calm, precise resistance. The woman noticed that, though he was relentless and focused, The rancher never wasted a movement, never let anger dictate action. His defense was methodical, disciplined, and protective, a shield that extended to her in every calculated motion. Finally, the men retreated, their confidence broken by a force they could not overcome. The cabin fell into a tense silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire. She sank to the floor, exhausted but alive, and allowed herself to breathe fully for the first time since night had fallen. The rancher lowered his rifle and approached her cautiously, his dark eyes scanning her face for injury or distress. "It's done," he said simply. "You're safe for now." Relief mingled with awe as she realized what had just occurred. She had survived not merely through luck, but through their combined effort, her quick instincts and his unwavering skill. A fragile sense of gratitude, deeper than fear, began to fill her chest. She understood that trust had been forged in the fires of danger, and that survival was no longer just a matter of fleeing, it was about standing together, relying on one another and facing threats as a unit. She looked at him, eyes wide with a mixture of wonder and respect. "Thank you for everything," she whispered, voice trembling. He inclined his head slightly, offering no grand gestures, only calm reassurance. "We survived," he replied, "and now we prepare for what comes next together." For the first time since her flight had begun, she allowed herself a spark of hope. She realized that survival could include trust, protection, and even the beginnings of a bond that transcended fear. And as she glanced at the rancher, standing strong and resolute beside her, she felt the unspoken promise that whatever came next, they would face it side by side. The first true light of morning crept over the horizon, bathing the prairie in soft shades of gold and rose. The wind had calmed, leaving only the gentle whisper of grass swaying in the quiet air. Inside the cabin, the aftermath of the night's terror lingered in the form of splintered wood and scattered debris, but a new sense of calm had settled over the space. The woman, still wrapped in her blanket, allowed herself to finally breathe freely. She had survived, not just by her own wit, but by the steady, unwavering protection of the Apache rancher beside her. He moved around the cabin with quiet precision, checking the remaining barricades and cleaning his rifle. His eyes were alert, scanning the horizon even as the danger had clearly passed. She watched him, marveling at the blend of strength and vigilance that seemed to define him. Each movement he made spoke of experience, skill, and a commitment to keep her safe, a commitment he had already demonstrated with actions that had saved her life. I think it's over," she said softly, her voice tinged with both relief and awe. "Not entirely," he replied calmly, lowering his rifle. "But for now it is safe enough. The threat has withdrawn." She nodded, allowing herself to shift closer to the fire. Her body ached from the tension and exertion of the night, yet her mind felt lighter than it had in years. The terror, the fear, and the relentless flight across the prairie had left marks on her soul, but the quiet strength of the man beside her began to fill the emptiness she had carried for so long. "You saved me," she whispered, barely audible, her voice carrying a mixture of gratitude and vulnerability. I don't even know how to thank you properly." He inclined his head slightly, his gaze steady and calm. "No thanks are necessary," he said simply. "You survived. That is enough." For a long moment she remained silent, studying him in the firelight. There was something in his presence that went beyond protection, something grounding, something that promised stability and safety in a world that had never offered her either. She realized that her trust in him was no longer tentative. It had taken root in the events of the night, solidified by his unwavering courage and quiet care. I never expected anyone to stand with me like this," she admitted, her voice trembling. "To fight for me when I couldn't fight for myself." "You had the strength," he replied, his tone calm but firm. You ran, you survived, you trusted enough to follow my lead. Courage comes in many forms, not only in fighting. Her chest tightened as she absorbed his words. For the first time, she felt that survival could mean more than escaping danger. It could mean hope, trust, and even the possibility of connection. She realized that the night had changed everything. The bond forged in fear had become something stronger, a shared resilience, a fragile but real companionship, and the promise that they would face whatever came next together. Minutes passed in quiet reflection. The prairie outside stretched endlessly, untouched and beautiful, a stark contrast to the chaos of the night. The cabin, though battered, had become a sanctuary, and within its walls she allowed herself to hope, not just for safety, but for the beginnings of a future where fear would not rule her, where trust could grow, and where she could finally feel that she was not entirely alone in the world. She looked at the rancher, gratitude and something warmer shining in her eyes. I think I can rest now," she said softly. He nodded, a small, approving gesture, and returned his attention to the horizon. "Rest," he said. "Tomorrow we face the world anew, and together we will be ready." For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to lie back, to close her eyes, and to feel the weight of fear lift from her shoulders. The night's terror had ended, and with the dawn came something far rarer than survival, hope. And as the fire crackled softly and the light of the rising sun filled the cabin, she understood that she had found more than safety. She had found someone who could stand beside her, someone she could trust, and perhaps someone she could come to rely on for far more than protection.